Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to today's SAAL structured conversation. This conversation is being recorded and closed captioning is available. I'm Maureen Garcello. I'm the Director of Program Evaluation, Compliance, and Assessment at San Diego State University. And on behalf of SAAL's Professional Learning and Development Committee, I'd like to thank you for joining us today for leveraging data to overcome emotional challenges in decision-making. SAAL and our committee are really committed to, and I think that today's presentation really underscores this. We're committed to involving, featuring, and representing diverse perspectives and identities in our offerings to meet your professional and development needs. And you too can help us achieve this goal by submitting a structured conversation proposal. So if something about this presentation sparks your interest in presenting yourself, we will post more information on the SAAL Structured Conversations page, and we'll also add it to the chat. During the presentation, we invite you to participate by asking questions, sharing comments, and providing feedback through the chat function that we'll be monitoring. And to get us started, please do put your name and your role in the chat so our presenters get a sense of who's in the room today. So please join me in welcoming our presenters from the University of Georgia, who of note were recently awarded the Bronze Level Assessment Persistence, Data Analytics, and Related Category for NASPA Excellence Awards with their Engagement Data Project. This project directly feeds the data for their Basic Needs Initiative and their efforts overall as a division to become more data informed. So with that foundation, please, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce University of Georgia's Annie Carlson Welch, Assistant to the Vice President for Student Affairs, Sarah Strickland, Assistant Director for Learning and Improvement, and Amber Atkinson, Senior Business Intelligence Analyst. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you all for having us today. So yes, we're going to have a conversation about how we leverage data to overcome emotional challenges in decision making. So to get us started, here's kind of what we're going to be doing for the next 50 or so minutes, but we're going to allow plenty of time at the end for questions. You're welcome while we're presenting to toss questions in there. We'll either answer them in the moment or as we can at the end. But feel free to toss your thoughts or your questions into the chat box and we'll kind of follow along as we go. But we're gonna do some quick introductions. We're gonna talk about what decision-making processes look like, a potential framework that is actually from a book that NASPA produced back in 2013. And then what are the challenges that exist alongside that? We're going to talk through a case study that, as Maureen mentioned, that came out of UGA, where we use this framework to consider our basic needs resources. And then we'll have discussion at the very end. All right, so a little bit about us. Maureen just did a great introduction of us, so thank you so much. So my name again is Annie Carlson Welch. I serve as assistant to the Vice President for Student Affairs, and in that role, it's a wide variety of things, chief of staff-like kind of duties, but essentially I try to manage all of the strategic planning and movement forward of things, of special projects happening across our division. And so to do that, of course includes assessment and data management work. And so I work directly with Sarah and Amber to do that. So Sarah, how about you introduce yourself?
Hi, Sarah Strickland. I'm the Assistant Director for Learning and Improvement here in the Office of Student Affairs at UGA. And so I coordinate assessment efforts in the Division of Student Affairs. And then Amber.
Hi, I'm Amber Atkinson. I'm a Senior Business Intelligence Analyst in the Office of Institutional Research at UGA, but I have a unique role in that we have an MOU with Student Affairs. So that means 50% of my time is spent with Student Affairs, working on their data needs, helping to improve operations, putting together data for assessment stuff, building dashboards, so many dashboards. And then, the rest of my time is spent on campus-wide enterprise level initiatives, stuff with DegreeWorks, Registrar's Office, all that kind of stuff. So it's nice to be here with all of y'all.
So here's our plan for the day as far as what we hope you're going to take away from this session. So we hope by the end there are 4 phases of the decision-making framework. So we hope that by the end of this presentation that you'll be able to apply those 4 phases and really pay attention to what data means within those 4 phases of decision-making, and that you'll be able to implement database strategies to recognize and reduce the impact of emotional and personal biases in decision-making. Not easy to do. So we'll talk through what that looks like. As I mentioned, this is based on a book that came out in 2013 that NASPA was a producer of. The title here on the screen and what the book looks like. If you're interested in buying this book, let me just toss out that Amazon is incredibly expensive to purchase it from. Buy it from NASPA instead. It's a very simple read. It's not a really long book. It comes with a nice little fold out in the middle, but it is a great one that I have found that I've had on my shelves since probably 2013 or 14 and have just referred back to here and there over the past decade, and it's been really helpful along my career. So it's an easy, simple one to refer back to. All right, so before we kind of really dig in and think about what a framework is, we want to kind of just give space to what the world of higher ed looks like right now. There are very few times in our history of higher education in the United States where we have been in situations that we are in now, where we are facing significant budget cuts, where we're facing concerns around what is the future of research look at our institutions, what is the future of our institutions, what's the point of higher education, where are we, and in student affairs, who are we serving, how do we get to serve them, in what ways? And I would imagine, I'm maybe speaking too broadly, but I think that for the most part in student affairs, we do a lot of our work with heart. And so what we're experiencing right now, generally speaking, is hard. Change is hard. And whether we like what the results might be or not, like, this is a hard process to go through. So how do we do it in a way that is meaningful, purposeful, intentional, and protects the heart of the work that we do as well? So I want to give some space for a second. You are welcome to come off mute and talk. You're welcome to toss your thoughts into the chat box. But what are your thoughts around decision-making and the use of data within decision-making?
I'm willing to talk if you're waiting for someone. Okay. I think that without using data, I'm a career coach at Duke University, Master of Engineering program. And I think without using data, when we're making decisions, the tendency is for the decisions to be emotional. Like, I like this project, so I think everyone should do it. I think this will be good for our students, so let's do this. And without making data-informed decisions, you can be sort of misprioritizing in your department.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. Some of the comments being put in the chat box are great too, like paralysis due to uncertainty of priorities and resources. Oh my gosh, is that true right now? That we need this more now more than ever. Absolutely. The data drives dollars. Data helps decision-making be more objective rather than subjective, much of what Chloe just shared as well. And fear from colleagues, I absolutely understand that. They're worried that if we share data, it might not be favorable to their department and are hesitant. Oh, absolutely. Part of the start of our data project that started back in 2017 was because we as a division really need to start sunsetting things, and we were having a hard time getting people to the place of sunsetting. And that was one component of why we started our data project, that we won't necessarily talk about today, but that's a really hard part, is just thinking through strategic prioritizing of our resources, which are really limited. Yeah, and that we need more outcomes-focused evaluation and less output-driven decisions. Absolutely. Okay, feel free to keep adding comments. These are great. We're going to move on to the next slide though. And I'm going to toss this over to Amber.
All right. So let's look at the decision-making framework. So there are 5 steps to it. It's very linear in nature, and that is intentional. So it works to guide us how we can, thoughtfully approach really complicated problems in student affairs, and they are always really complicated. We don't do easy things in this work. As you can see, while it is linear, there is context kind of wrapping itself around, steps or phases 1 through 4. So identifying the problem through assessment. And that is to help you ground your thought processes in your actual current realities, right? So like the things that we just discussed. And so next we are going to talk a little bit about context and what that means. So context, when we talk about it in the context, we talk about context in the context of the framework. We're talking about your professional, campus, and external context. So professionally, what standards, competencies, research, like what's shaping the field? What's the history behind the work? What are y'all doing in practice? Your campus. What kind of institution are you working at? What size is it? What's the campus culture there? What's the climate like? I would, hazard a guess that UGA probably looks quite different from, an institution up in the Northeast. I would wager that UGA looks quite different from other institutions within our own state, right? So like decisions that we make here, our context is very different than even at Georgia Tech down the road, an hour to Atlanta. And then externally, what's happening in the broader world around you? And obviously the answer is so much is happening in the broader world around us, but, outside of nationally, but locally, right? So like what's happening in your community? What are the things, the factors happening that could influence your decision-making or should influence? So the next slide. So phase 1 in the process is identification of the problem, and it sounds very simple, but we'll find out it is not as simple as it seems. So you do the initial appraisal. What is the thing you're trying to fix? What needs to be addressed? You need to try to unpack and define that problem. What information do you need to make sense of it? Who are the people involved, the stakeholders? Who's in charge of it? What is your specific role in it? Because sometimes problems come to you, but not all problems are your problems. Sometimes you're just aware of them, or you're working in parallel to somebody else's problem, or your work is affected by a problem that is really none of your business, but it's hard for it creates another problem. And then figure out with the problem, what do you actually want to happen? And that can look like a lot of different things. What do you hope could happen with the problem in the short term? And then, sustain in the long term. And what kind of impact might that have on, your work, the campus community? Next slide. So after identifying the problem, you'll want to look at all of your options for solving it. And that means looking at, at UGA, we like to say, we love tradition. We love tradition at UGA. So what are the things how have we handled this previously? Things that are similar to whatever the problem might be. What resources are available? Do we even have, a person, a budget, any existing structures that could work to support this problem? Is there a way to combine, resources across departments? Are there other people who might have a different experience or context with this problem? And then, certainly, what barriers are there? Are there anybody that could be, affected negatively by any kind of solution you put in place? Obviously, there's always like pros and cons to different solutions that you could look at. And then in the end, how will you justify it? Moving forward, if it's something that you're going to have to live with for a while, especially if it requires, financial resources. The next slide.
So we have blasted through step 1. We've identified the problem. We know what we're doing. We're like ready to go. We moved through step 2. We did a scan. Sometimes the scan is like 3 minutes and you're like, we have nothing. Let's do this. And sometimes it can take time. But you've just like neatly gone through step 1 and 2, and now we're at step 3, which is implementation. And so that's moving forward with our solution. So what's the plan of action? We've got this information, we know what our problem is, we know what we're doing. So what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? What tasks need to be accomplished, who's going to do what. And so sometimes when you have big projects, you may have multiple people taking on different tasks. So that's an important step. Who's doing what? When will it be accomplished? What's the timeline on this? Does this need to be finished by the end of the semester, which is next week, or do we have until the end of the year? So that's sort of the who, what, when, where part of the implementation. And then what are we going to do when problems may arise? Because if anyone here has ever worked in higher education, you know that there is a chance that there's going to be some unforeseen stuff that comes up. So what's the plan for that? And then does the problem need to be reappraised? And we're going to talk about this some more, but sometimes you get deep into problem solving and realize that maybe you've been asking the wrong questions or looking at the wrong problem. So that's another important piece to keep in mind. And then we're just going to drive right into phase 4, which is assessment. So we've done the thing. We know what the problem is. We know what we're doing. We know what our options are. We've implemented it. And so now what? And so this 4th phase is assessing what we've done. Did we achieve the desired outcome? Who did we consult with to determine the impact of the plan? So who was involved in this? A lot of times when you're doing assessment work and data work, you may not necessarily be the person doing the work with students or the work in the department. You're just assessing what's going on. So did you talk to the right people and make sure that the questions were answered? And then reflect on the process. Did you learn from your mistakes and successes? Like I said, there's going to be stuff that comes up. So are we learning from this process? That's the best part about assessment, right? Is finding out what we need to work on, what we need to move forward on. What we do differently next time, and then what we learn through this process that we can implement next time. So I think a lot of what we do is constantly a learning experience. So what did we learn and how are we going to take it and use it next time? And then what did you learn as a professional? That's like one of my favorite things is like, what did I learn? I didn't know this before. I didn't know about this department. I didn't know about this problem, but now I do.
Man, I was muted. That is the whole DMF. That's the framework of how to use a methodical approach to solving some problems or making some decisions. We're going to talk through a case study now, though, to kind of exemplify that as simple as this is, it's also complicated. And so we want to walk you through our basic needs project. And before we get started into this, I do feel the need to give a caveat that UGA is not a leader in the United States on basic needs. We are learning. So for some campuses on this call, you're gonna be like, wow, we have way more than UGA does. You do, probably, and some don't have as much as we do either. And we are just in the process of learning just like everybody else. And that's part of the context of our institution that I'm gonna talk through in just a moment when I get to the next slide. Okay, so context for our case study. So there's a lot of information on this slide, some of which I'm not going to bother covering, but the important parts are that to understand first about our basic needs effort, we're primarily going to talk today about our food pantry. And our food pantry on our campus was started in 2012 by the Panhellenic Council, so the council that oversees our historically social sororities on campus. They saw a need. They decided from a philanthropic standpoint that they wanted to support the creation of a food pantry that wasn't in existence previously. And so they began supporting it, entirely student-led. But over time, because of their work with it and because it became more and more popular over time, the operations of our food pantry became deeply embedded within their council's leadership, was part of their elections, was part of their bylaws. Like it became a huge component of what the council was actually about, even though we have one of the largest Greek communities in the country, and they also need to be about women's leadership. So they were operationally advised by the Greek Life Office. One staff member was dedicated to serving as the advisor to the food pantry, And over time, that started taking up more and more of her job description as well. When we started this project, CAS standards did not exist. So I know Dan Bureau is on this call right now. So Dan, you can't hold us too accountable for this. We didn't have CAS standards yet for basic needs. We do now, and so those are things that we're now incorporating in, but at the time we didn't. And we have a really robust, as you've kind of heard throughout this, very robust data process established throughout student affairs. We collect a lot of information about our students, what they're doing, where they're going, how they're engaged across our division. And we also have a really big food scholarship program at UGA. So those are some of the things, the issues we were managing from a professional standpoint around how are we advising and managing what's going on there. I imagine that some folks know about UGA a little bit, large public research one institution. We have a large student body. We have a growing international student population like many schools. We have several professional schools and are soon to have a med school as well. So the growth in our graduate population is substantial and intentional. Obviously within the state, we are one of two major institutions, Georgia Tech being the other, but we have a massive university system across the state. What is really important to know about UGA that is probably not as well known because of our football culture is that as an institution, especially one in the South, we are very risk averse. We tend to walk with ease and care and be very cognizant of what might happen if we make a certain decision. And so we are very intentional in our decision making, for better or for worse. But that is something we have to take into account when we are making moves is how will this be perceived? What will, how does this make UGA look? We are also very driven by the desire to be ranked higher and higher every year. And so that is an intentional push by our leadership to seek rankings. And so we're very focused, again, in being careful because of that. Other things to know is that we have a local food bank. But that food bank, we have some challenges initially with how we partnered with them. They are a USDA food bank, and so there are interesting funding challenges now within the federal government. But at least as the start of this project, we did not have a partnership with that USDA food bank at the time. There are food deserts across Athens. It is actually very hard to get to a grocery store from our campus. It is not walkable to get to a grocery store. And we also have transportation issues across our little city as well. Okay, I am going to kick it now over to Amber, who's going to talk through a little bit about how we identified this problem and what kind of led to us wanting to focus on our basic needs efforts.
All right. So what is the problem? The problem was that our student food pantry was no longer able to serve the number of students who wanted to use it. And so the context really matters here. So the pantry was student-led. We just talked about that. The Women of Panhellenic were running it as part of their philanthropic and leadership initiatives. We're at a really big institution. We are focused on data, big focus on student success, appearances, and the partnering with the local food bank, it wasn't really an option at the time. It didn't feel realistic. So post-pandemic, we've been keeping data on, in student affairs since 2017, and since the pandemic, usage of the food pantry skyrocketed. Anecdotally, at first, there was conversations about, wow, the food was stocked on the shelves and then it was gone 3 hours later, which, could sound like hyperbole. It could, who knows? I don't know. These are students manning the pantry. We're not part of, the process of supporting its operations. So I don't know, but there was a lot of concerns about sustainability, management of the pantry. Hold on, sorry a second. So well-being had not shown interest in taking over the food pantry. There was a lot of concern that, we didn't want to be taking something from students. This was very much part of their identity, their leadership, their culture, taking that from them. We didn't want to, we just didn't want to be in that position. Greek Life was providing support, but it was overwhelming. It was one of those things where, okay, this is like 5% of your time, but then it balloons and then suddenly it's edging out everything else that you need to do because of the issues. And also there was senses of, just because Greek life is, supporting Panhellenic, does that mean that they should be, supporting these really big operations? Should they be solving this problem? I don't know. And so there were certainly emotions involved, and definitely the sense of, we don't want to take this away from students, but how can we support them, and whose job should that be? So the next slide, we get into trying to make sense of all of our options. But surprise, there was a twist, guys. The twist is that when we started to kind of think collectively about, what can we do to support Panhellenic, they actually met with the VP of Student Affairs here at UGA, Dr. Cook, and they said, we can't keep doing this. We want to support it. We want to volunteer, but we can no longer carry on with the operations of the food pantry. So the financing of it, they're going to, I think they were going to Sam's Club and purchasing all of this food and stocking the shelves, and it's just too much for them to keep going with. And so that really forced us to change everything. We couldn't just look at the current model, what do we need to do to tweak it, to get them better support? We had to, start over, because the problem is no longer the problem that we started with. We had to reassess all of these assumptions that we'd had, and try to look at, the data really from the ground up. So next, we went back once again to identifying the problem. And that meant that our team, our continuous improvement team, stepped in. We looked at all of the data that we possibly could. And that meant, not just pulling all of the data possible from, it's called Pantry Soft software. We pulled all of that out, but we also met with all of these different little like units across campus that were also focusing on basic needs. So we had this big kind of decentralized support system across campus. There was, I think there was Student Government Association had a Fresh Express that was in like South Campus. There was a professional clothes closet. We met with folks who were running Bulldog Basics. And so they facilitated students ordering, things like toiletries, diapers if they had children. There are just lots of different, people on campus who cared very much about the basic needs of students. And we got all of these spreadsheets, got all of this, qualitative anecdotal evidence. And then what we did was put it together with what we had in the data warehouse. So in my role in IR, we're very lucky that we have access to things like, the academic data. Are they undergrad students? Are they grad students? Are they first generation? Are they transfer students? Are they, in-state, out of state, like all of this kind of stuff, so that we could try to look for a pattern, anything that would help us just do a better job in figuring out what the problem is. I mean, certainly the problem was we need to, ensure that students have food, but what else can we do? Are there other people that we need to involve? So with that, we were able to see there were certainly some patterns in the data. Usage rates were really wild. I mean, you can just see like the curve was like whoop, like straight up, like after the pandemic. There were some points, in the line graph where we're like, what was happening during that week? Like, why was there such a boom right there? There was definitely high usage among international graduate students, which we had expected some usage, but the proportion was really kind of striking to see. The housing location didn't matter. Going into our little like data deep dive, we really spent like 4 hours together in a room, just asking questions, looking at the data, trying to see, you know, what is there. We thought perhaps, you know, part of the speed in which, you know, shelves were emptied, we're like, well, maybe they live close to each other. Maybe, you know, they're communicating with each other. I don't know. But we plotted it out on a map. That was nothing. They were, you know, there's certain students who live on campus, who, you know, commute in, and then others who just live like in, you know, off-campus style housing. We could see that students were using the services all across campus. We were able to put that together and see, like, you know, these students who are using the pantry were also, you know, ordering toiletries from Bulldog Basics. And then, you know, one of the things that we found that we weren't really ready for was that staff and faculty were also using the pantry. So part of the pantry software is you have to, you know, you put in an 81 number. So that's like our UGA ID. And when I was running the data, I was like, who are these? Why is this coming out? Like, did I mess this up? Was something wrong with my code? No, they were not students. I did find them as employees. And then sometimes I think there were also folks who were, you know, they had an ID, but they weren't students or employees. So I think they were probably partners of some of the folks on campus. So we were seeing like a really interesting picture of all of these different people who all had need for food. And that really kind of shaped the problem and, you know, what we needed to do moving forward. With that, I think I'm kicking it off to Sarah.
So we started looking at our options, and I think Amber really just did not give herself enough credit for how much data we had. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of lines of data from all across campus. We were meeting with students, we were meeting with staff, we were pulling stuff from several different systems. So, I mean, we had a big picture. And then, of course, what happens sometimes on a large campus, we had little pockets all over campus. And so when we started looking at what our options were, you know, it turned into a conversation about, you know, how do we want to bring things together? How are we going to manage this? So, I mean, the first option, and this was before, kind of before the Panhellenic women came to our VP and said, we want out, was should we give them more resources? Should we fund the food pantry more for Panhellenic, or should we help them get volunteers or something like that? I mean, that was one option. Should we move it to a different department? Should we centralize it within student affairs? Should we fundraise? That's always an option. Do we just throw money at it? Could that be the solution? We talked about preventing faculty and staff usage, and that was talk about like emotional decision making. That was a kind of a difficult conversation, and we'll talk about it a little more, but ultimately we've left that. So right now that's still happening. Tell computer science they need to do something, and that's kind of a funny statement because like you said, we were picking up patterns. And so we saw that a lot of our food pantry users were from kind of our STEM departments, computer science, engineering, that sort of thing. So should we give it back to them and say, we found this pattern in our data, do something? Should we centralize it? Should we keep it decentralized? Our campus is long. And so even our student center is maybe not exactly in the center of campus. And then you've got, you know, pretty popular areas of campus just spread out all over the place. So would it even make sense to centralize it into just one location? Ultimately, we really discovered that we were going to have to partner with the local food bank. And part of the reason, we'll talk about that with the resources unmet, and part of the reason that we hadn't was that we just didn't have the capacity to do that. It's an arduous process to start that partnership. It's great once you get there, but we needed somebody on our side to be able to actually start that process. And then also like we said, the Panhellenic women had taken this on, 10 plus years ago. It was a lot of work. It was a labor of love for them, not just like we were considering throwing money at the problem. So, we didn't want to make it seem like we're taking this from them because they can't handle it anymore, because that was definitely not the case. And so, kind of acknowledge their work in all of it rather than just take it over and kind of ignore that. And so with our resources, we had limited short-term fundraising, but we had short-term funding, but we had great fundraising potential. And so we have foundation folks within student affairs who can do fundraising. We have people who are going out in the community and fundraising, that sort of thing. So that was an option. We had a staff capacity issue. Like I said, even just partnering with the local food bank, we needed somebody who had the time and the capacity to do that. So that was something that we had to look at when we're looking at options. And then also opportunity to enhance partnerships. And we'll talk about that too, that there are departments on campus that are already well suited to help with this. And so should we strengthen those partnerships?
All right, so here is initially what we ultimately chose to do, and this was this past fall semester, right around November or so. We moved the food pantry operations out of the Office of Greek Life and over to what's called our Student Care and Outreach Department with support from our Tate Student Center. So Student Care and Outreach could provide support from a standpoint, of course, of being a central hub of student well-being across campus. It made a lot of sense to ask them to take it on. And we also need to consider the physical space being in our Tate Student Center. And so we really needed them to step into and provide the physical support, knowing that part of this was physically staffing a physical location and needing to manage access to that location as well. We temporarily increased pay for one staff member within Student Care and Outreach to be able to take on some of the duties that were needed. That included, as Sarah mentioned, the really extensive, overwhelmingly extensive paperwork that needed to be completed with the local food bank so we could begin receiving deliveries from them. Panhellenic was absolutely willing. They're like, we can't manage this anymore, but we would love to still keep helping. Like, that was really important, being able to continue serving as volunteers. We also had to help work with them, of course, and the Greek Life office did this primarily, but in considering how we kind of detangle this from their council operations, like, they needed to actually rework bylaws and leadership roles to kind of unravel this. So they needed time also to let go of it too. And so they really want to continue serving as volunteers. We are, of course, happy to let them continue that. And then we sought additional volunteers from the student body and throughout our division and across campus as well. And then we implemented a monthly food pantry working group. And this group meets, like I said, monthly. It includes long-term planning. So those meetings were intended to start as, what are we doing right now? How have we solved whatever the problems were that we have been working on? And what are the next that we need to look at, considering long-term issues that also need to be addressed? So in the most immediate, this was what got put in place when we were like, action needs to happen now. And here are the options. After we looked through those options that Sarah mentioned, here are the ones we're willing to implement immediately. And then after we did that, that food pantry meeting, that monthly meeting, is really the group that is doing that assessment work now. And so we have been looking at, what is the impact? How do we need to adjust that? So over the past several months, what we have looked at is, while we have more food being delivered than ever before, and by being delivered, I mean it is coming to our state student center versus our students driving to Sam's Club and spending, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars on food to stock that pantry. We are now receiving more food than ever before. It's not enough. We cannot keep the pantry full. So we receive a massive amount of food on Monday mornings. It is gone by Wednesday afternoons. So the bonus, if you want to look at the light there, is that previously we were being wiped out in 2 hours time. So now we're being wiped out after 2.5 or so days. So at least we're getting to 2.5 days. It's not enough though. So we have to keep solving that issue. Our staffing isn't enough. We have data to justify a student fee increase. And we were able to push that through our system office recently and did get enough of a student fee increase to be able to hire somebody. So this data was able to support the need for adding a additional staff member, not just adding some, more duties to one person's time, but actually saying we need a whole person dedicated to this area. I fully anticipate over the next several years that will increase beyond just the one as well. Our space is inadequate, and we have no solution for that right now. So we are sitting in just an inadequate space. That is something we will continue addressing over time, but for right now, it is a fairly large closet. And that is not enough for the amount of food that needs to be in there. We do, as was mentioned, we do have some spaces around campus too that others are managing. In particular, our Student Government Association manages Fresh Express. That is something we recently had a conversation with them about. They have several refrigerators for fresh food that exists on the south side of our campus. And so is there an opportunity to help incorporate that into our food pantry and make sure we also get fresh food into that central location as well? Do we address faculty or staff use? We also have RAs using it, even though they receive a meal plan as part of their pay. And so do we address it? Do we not? We have chosen at this time to not address it. The reality is that there are faculty and staff who do not have enough resources and are not paid high enough to be able to not use the food pantry. And probably the location is much more convenient than what our local food resources offer. And so this is not something we choose to address at this point. We might in the future. More likely we will consider addressing RA use and just making sure they have what they need as student employees. We have, there's pros and cons to decentralizing resources across campus. Right now, we are choosing to absorb duplicative efforts. So I mentioned Fresh Express. We are talking to Student Government Association about actually combining those efforts so that we are better connected. And that we're also just making sure students who come use the food pantry know where other resources are around campus. Recognizing that not all students are going to come to the central section of campus, that they might remain academically on the south side of campus and need resources there, or vice versa, they may be on the north side. We have an incredibly hilly campus, so to get around and walk groceries around is a bit challenging. So we recognize that decentralizing actually might be the best way to do it for right now. And so we're managing those challenges as needed. And then we're looking at future solutions. This is ripe for fundraising. This is an easy area where we can be asking for support from our alumni and from local businesses. And so that is something we are deep in the midst of. Panhellenic had already done a good amount of this, and they were gracious enough to actually shift all of their fundraising and donor funds over to us and not they did the hard work on it. So they could have chosen to spend that money in some different ways. They were really gracious to instead say, this stays with the food pantry. And so we worked on rewriting fund agreements and things to move those things over. We're working on a grocery store partnership. The USDA Food Bank is a great partnership to have, but it serves food from Georgia farms only. And as much as we want to support our local farmers, the downfall to that is our international students using the food pantry aren't going to be eating the foods that come from the state of Georgia necessarily. And so we're missing things like lentils. That is an incredible need among our students, like something as simple as lentils. And so for right now, we go and purchase the add-on things that suit what our international students are needing. But we are recognizing a long-term partnership, likely, with Kroger or something that is local to our area to help kind of fill in the gaps where the USDA Food Bank is lacking for us. Obviously, I mentioned space that we need to keep figuring that out as well. And so what have we learned along the way? I mean, because that's probably the most important part and what I hope a lot of you are here for as well is, we did a lot of assumption around how people felt or believed or what their intent was in the ways that they operated their different basic needs, things around campus. And rather than asking the question and having an uncomfortable conversation, it was easier to just assume that nobody wants to give up their things. And so for Amber, Sarah, and I, it was a lot easier for us because to this work, we are outsiders. And so we could, in some ways, almost serve as consultants around campus, and we could go to campus partners and say, just kind of curious, like, If we combined resources, would you be willing to? And lo and behold, people are like, we just want what's right for the students. So how can we be helpful there? And so not assuming intent or ownership is really important in this, and being willing to go and have some uncomfortable conversations. And if that means you pull yourself out of the process and send somebody else to go do that conversation, again, I think that was actually a huge win for us, was that the three of us were managing it on behalf of anybody else who may have had differing relationships before. Group problem solving is incredibly important. That might be an obvious, but there were times where people felt like they were on their own islands in this process, and bringing everybody together and saying, where are you? How are you feeling? How do we do this? What are your solutions? Our very first food pantry meeting, there was knowledge that Greek Life has gained over 10 years of managing this process, that folks in student care and outreach were going, oh, what about this idea? And then Greek Life could say, we've tried that, and here's the issue with it. And so we could all come together instead of trying to come up with solutions that have already been used before. Let's be more efficient with our work. And then let's rely on our data. Our data told us things that we knew already. Our data also told us things we had no idea were going on. And so going back and relying on that, being willing to go hunting for some answers, and also like coming up with ideas and then going, oh, that's nothing. That turns out, it's not about we really had this idea at one point. We're going to find that all these students are kind of living around the same area, and we just need to go to transportation and get a bus route out there and it'll be great. No, that wasn't the case. Our students are in need, are spread all across Athens. And so really rely on your data, be willing to realize you might be wrong in something and step back and try again.
So I'm sure that you guys have picked up on these issues, but there's some issues that arise. Some of these were specific to us, and some of these are just part of the problem solving process. And so the first thing was not spending enough time identifying the problem. And you notice that with our kind of rewind and having to go back, and that was sort of something not necessarily that we had missed. That was something that came up in the middle of it. But not spending enough time identifying the problem, you might miss the real cause of something. And so it's easy to think that you've got this problem. Oh, we need more food, and then jump into it and start trying to solve the problem. And then it turns out that you do need more food, but you also need more space, and you need more workers, and you need more money, and you need more. So there's likely to be more than one problem. So make sure you've identified everything. Talking about emotional decision making, like student affairs people are heart people. And so we're solution oriented people, and we want to fix things. And so that was even for us, and I say even for us, like, we're heartless data people, which we are not. But even for us, like, we just wanted to jump in and like, let's feed people. Like, let's get the money and we get the food, and we're going to solve this problem. And that is why it's so important to refer back to your data and make sure you have all the information before you start problem solving. Personal ties to projects or outcome that create emotional investment. Some of this was factual and some of it was perceived, like Annie just mentioned. Like, we thought that we were going to have a lot of trouble with some people holding on to things. And a lot of people, for the most part, overwhelmingly, everyone was like, we want what's best serves students. But I still think there's that emotional part, especially when you're talking about feeding people. That's just such like an emotional thing. History or tradition that prevents change, like we have mentioned, that's big here. So that's something that we have to deal with for a lot of things that other institutions may not, but that is an issue for us. Lack of good data to add to context within each phase. And we talked about this too. We spent months and months and months and months gathering data from all across campus, different systems. And then Amber was smooshing it all together, like Amber does. And so it's important that you know what you're working with. So go hunt that data down, find everything that you can that will help you. And then leadership may have conflicting opinions or desire different outcomes. And that's the nature of what we do. You can have great ideas, and there may be traditions in the way. There may be risk-averse institutions in the way. There may be political things in the way. And so, that's part of our work, part of what we do. But just, keep that in mind as you're working through something like this. And so we have a suggested update to the decision-making framework. As you saw at the beginning, it is a very neat 4-step process. You identify the problem and then you move right through the steps very neatly, and everything is perfect because that's how it always works when you're working in education and working with human beings. But for those of us who don't necessarily work in that linear way, our suggestion is that the decision-making cycle, if you will. You saw like the difficulty we had getting out of phase 1 and 2 because we had to go back. And I would say that we probably went back to phase 1 way more times than we're letting you know about. There's a lot of work that goes into identifying the problem, like I just talked about. And so think of this more cyclical. We're all familiar with the assessment cycle, right? It's not perfect. Sometimes you go back and forth, and it's always there's always more to learn too. So it really never ends. It's not like we get to phase 4 assessment and we go, we're done, moving on to the next project. And so this is our suggestion for an update, the decision-making cycle.
All right, so that's our presentation. We are happy to take questions. We would love to know what you like, what you don't like. How might you use this? What are your takeaways? Again, happy to answer questions as well, whether that is the chat box or coming off mute, whatever is easiest for you. Oh, and I also mentioned, by the way, there was a comment in the chat box earlier around, did we look at models across the country from other institutions? And yeah, yes, with an asterisk caveat. Yes, and the models we started looking at, especially at some of our peer institutions, are so good that it was that was hard. So if there are any friends from the University of Tennessee or now from Ohio State, the Ohio State University, we aspire to that level of work. But looking at something like that became actually overwhelming for us because it's so good. And it's so far down the line from us that we were like, okay, that's our aspiration, but we need to actually back up and like, what is right for us right now? And how do we start there? So we did look at models, we continue to look at models, but maybe not to the depth of like really saying, here's something we're going to exactly mimic and then follow. Okay, so some other questions that popped in there. So how did the Division of Student Affairs build a relationship with IR to be able to centrally collect data for your use and share FTE? Yes, great question. We actually did a whole presentation last year at NASPA about our partnership, which is a really kind of unique and interesting, fun partnership that we developed. This honestly came out a little bit out of a fluke, but it was a great situation. So learn from our fluke. We had our own data lead in the Division of Student Affairs for several years when we first started our data initiative. And what we found in that process was, while that was all well and good, there were a lot of barriers institutionally to what that person could access. And so when that person left the institution, we used it as an opportunity to work with IR to say, what if we shared a position? It benefited both of us. We also were like, you know what, we could probably figure out how to get this work more efficiently down into 20 hours. What if we paid for half the salary, you all paid for the other half, and then we all win in that? And this was a model our IR had tested out with other departments as well. I would certainly argue that our partnership is the best one. It's the most probably effective and most used of the partnerships that exist, but we essentially just built it by creating an MOU together, and then we have worked on how do we manage what our 20 hours a week looks like, and that is flexible. So we're not really like stringent on those 20 hours because sometimes Amber needs to work on US News and World Report, and sometimes she needs to build basic needs stuff for us. So we kind of bounce back and forth. I'm happy to answer more questions about that relationship though, if anyone wants to email me about it. Okay, do you have any advice on how would you handle when those outside of a department, such as faculty, staff, and students, are acknowledging a problem, but the actual problem is ignoring the problem because of fear of how others may expect they go about doing things? Oh, okay. Hold on, this is a long one. Let me read this real quick. Yes. Okay. So the example is a department that may actually fear collecting data because of what it might tell them. And I would say so, and so how do you engage them in problem solving? And I think to me, and Amber and Sarah jump into, like, I think one of the biggest parts around buy-in is just going and sitting with somebody and like talking through it with them so they understand what your intention is. I will say, like, again, as the three of us being outsiders to basic needs at UGA, I mean, I had to go work with an AVP and kind of be like, I'm not trying to take over your work. I'm not trying to say that you or your departments aren't doing well. I am wanting, we've got to figure out something though, because there's a problem here and we can't ignore that problem. And so, we talked through his concerns around how we were approaching the situation and how we could address that together. So that's not, directly answering around another department. I think talking though is really important. Our Bulldogs Basic, I think Sarah mentioned Bulldogs Basic, is actually a separate unit that exists outside of student affairs, and that provides toiletries, especially diapers, to students. I went over, they're actually just like across the quad from us. I went over there and sat down with their director and just had a really honest conversation of here's where we are, here's what I'm learning, here's what we're kind of putting together, and we just want to know like what you're experiencing, like what's hard for you, what's working and what's not. And I think coming to her from that angle of I'm here for partnership and just wanting to understand how we can all do this better. Again, in honor of students, it's not about us. Like we have to remove ourselves and our ego in this work from it and just say, if we're here for the students, how do we best do that together? And that was honestly, that helped in a lot of our conversations of overcoming some of the worry or the fear people have. Amber and Sarah, is there anything you would add to that?
I think it helps that we have like the broader, I guess, like data culture in place, that we've been collecting this data. And so I guess there's just an expectation that everybody's doing it, right? And so we don't really have necessarily that one department that's like, nah, I don't need to see that. I'm okay, thanks. So I think if, maybe while you know that this is an issue, that this is a problem, if you start working on other things too, I mean, at some point, I think folks have to come to the table when they see that everybody else is already there. You know what I mean?
Well, thank you so much, Amber, Annie, and Sarah. We were thrilled to host you in this session. I'm sure that there are a lot of ideas. I hope that this would provide a little bit of therapeutic refreshment for folks who are having to make these tough decisions. And it's also wonderful to have a framework to go from. Oh, and I see Denisha. Do we have? Yeah, Denisha, please go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I was typing it in the chat, but it ended up being too long. So my question is, it's not necessarily, I don't know if it's a data question, but more along a resource. So from where I sit, a lot of the problems or situations that arise are actually being taught in the classroom, right? And the way that you guys have explained the situation about the food pantry had me thinking about the a case study that I did, public health, community development, and disparities case study. But my question is, I've had struggles with my leadership being interested in bringing academics to the table to talk about it, because we're teaching the students how to handle it, but we're not really applying it now. So, you have any advice on to even how to approach that, for that to even be a resource? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I'll use an example from our health center to answer that, because our health center actually partners quite a bit with faculty around campus, especially in our school of public health, to do a considerable amount of research and assessment out of their area and incorporate that back into the work that the health center is doing. I think where One thing that's been helpful is utilizing undergraduate researchers in that. And so bringing them in from that perspective and engaging students in the conversation who then, work with faculty to help guide that research. There's pros and cons to that, but that has been one way that our health center has in particular involved faculty, that they have also involved faculty directly into some of the work that they've done too, whether that is writing up reports and sending it over and just saying from your expert area, from your, from your fundamental knowledge, what can you add to this perspective that we're not considering? Because from a practitioner base, we're doers, right? Like we don't always step back and think about either like what is the context of the rest of the world working on, or like what does this work look like on a broader scale? And so I think that identifying faculty whose research aligns is a really good place beyond undergraduate researchers to get engaged in this kind of work. And our health centers had a really, really successful time doing that. I'm not sure if that directly answers your question. I think there's lots of opportunity in doing that. Let me add to this basic needs piece. We did have one of our areas is overseen by a director of advising out of one of our colleges. And so she's not teaching faculty necessarily, but she is deeply engaged with the faculty. And they are also faculty who are problem solvers themselves and don't like, seeing students in their classroom who are going hungry, obviously. And so from that perspective, they bring a lot of personal into that work. And that's actually where we come and balance some of it is love your personal in it. And here's the data to support what you are or are not doing. And how can we work together on it? And so the computer science program is one where we're starting some partnership there. We have information, we have some knowledge around what is and isn't going well there. And how do we work together to kind of maybe not solve the problems, but help limit some of the issues that are occurring and make sure that students have what they need before they're in need. So that we're heading that direction now.
Thank you, Annie. Again, thank you all so much. Please let's have a little round of applause for our presenters from the University of Georgia today. A recording of today's session along with any resources will be shared via email to those in attendance and available on SAAL's website. We hope to see you, and Annie gave, I think, an involuntary a shout out to Dan Bureau, who will be our next structured conversation presenter on CAS standards. So look for those invitations coming out on the listserv for May 20th. Thank you all so much and have a great day and a safe week.
Thank you, everyone.